Good evening and welcome everyone. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes as people continue to join. Thank you. Gary, could you please put up the agenda? Okay. As you can see tonight, our agenda is fairly similar to the other workshops we've done in this series. Welcome everyone. Tonight we'll be discussing wildfire prevention and hazard policy in the coastal zone as it relates to the LCP update. At the end of the session, we will also have a Q&A. So we do have a few ground rules for this meeting. First is to remember to be respectful and courteous of everyone's time. We have enabled the chat and Q&A functions. Because the Q&A function is specifically enabled, if possible, it is appreciated if you can make sure that your questions are going into that function rather than into the chat, but I will be doing my best to make sure I am monitoring both. And both the chat and the meeting will be recorded. The workshop will end at 7 p.m. And of course, as always, any written comments and input at any time are also perfectly acceptable and encouraged ways to submit comment to the LCP update email that's listed at the bottom there and also available on our webpage. Our panelists tonight are myself, Cecily Condon, the project review manager for planning in Permit Sonoma, Gary Helfrich, our planning project manager for the LCP update, Robert Aguero, a senior environmental specialist, and everyone else will also be more than encouraged to introduce themselves too. And Caroline Stafford with our fire prevention. They changed names fairly recently and I keep messing it up. And John Mack, our natural resources manager, is on the call as well.
Okay, so this is Gary Helfrich, and just wanted to quickly review our project timeline and where we are in the LCP process so that everybody understands all the opportunities for public input. We're right now at the public review draft workshops, and these will end at the end of the topic workshop series. Our next step will be to prepare policy options and a draft for the Planning Commission in spring of 2021. We're hoping to go to the board in the summer. And because this is the coastal plan, the Coastal Commission has to certify the plan. And our anticipation is that the plan will be certified by the end of 2021. But at each one of these steps, there's opportunity for public input. And so I really want to once again encourage everyone to provide your comments and don't feel as though there's pressure to provide them right now or provide them during the workshops. We'll comments are always welcome. Another point that there's been some confusion about is there have been no changes to the public review draft of the local coastal plan. We want everybody to be looking at the same document all the way through the public review process. We're taking everyone's comments and everyone's input and creating policy options for the Planning Commission draft local coastal plan. But the document you're looking at now is the same document that was published in September of 2019. The local coastal plan is part of the local coastal program. And this is an important thing to understand because it has a lot to do with where standards are created and how the Coastal Act is implemented in Sonoma County. The plan is essentially the general plan for the coast. The coastal zoning code is how this plan is implemented, and that's where you'll find specific performance standards that carry out the policies in the coastal plan. And then the third part is the administrative manual that is for staff and the public to interpret both the code and the local coastal plan policies. So all three of these things are part of the local coastal program. And I'm just emphasizing that because sometimes it's confusing because they're both the LCP, but it's the entire package that is the program. So as Cecily mentioned, tonight's topic is wildfire hazard, and things have changed. And this is probably the one section of the LCP that we are going to be doing the most work on, because we just have a new understanding of wildfire hazards in the coastal zone. It's been completely changed by the wildfires in 2017 and 2019. And so with that, to really, I think, help everyone understand wildfire risk, wildfire mitigation, and wildfire resiliency, turn it over to Corleone.
Okay, so many buttons, so little time. So my name is Caroline Safford, and I work in Permanent Sonoma for the Fire Prevention and Hazmat Division, where my primary focus is, as it has been for many, many years in a variety of capacities, on wildfire risk reduction and the things we can do in the county to reduce risk to lives and property from wildfire. This is one of my greatest heroes, Dr. Jack Cohen, who was one of the first people to come along and say, whoa, 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 whoa. We're looking at this wildland fire problem as if it is exclusively a forest fire problem. But it's not. There's something else going on, which is that we're having lots of incidents where you have communities with burned houses and green trees all around them, and what's going on. And I would highly recommend that you give a Google to Dr. Jack Cohen and read all the stuff that he's come up with. A lot of the slides that you'll be seeing are courtesy of Dr. Cohen. His primary message was that home loss and wildland fires is primarily due to two things. One is vulnerabilities on the structure itself, and two is the fuels within 100 feet or so of that structure, which we also refer to as defensible space, right? You can also add other components like weather. Extreme winds certainly have an impact, and the position of the house on the slope and other topographic features to the probability of loss. But at the end of the day, vulnerabilities on the structure and fuels within 100 feet. Now, not coincidentally, one of my other heroes, Dr. Steve Quarles, likewise, Google him. He's an expert in the actual elements on structures which cause ignition of the home. And he, like Dr. Cohen, says that maintaining an effective defensible space is one critical component, along with careful selection of building materials and construction design features that are used in the construction of that house. Many of these can also be retrofit to increase safety. Now, wildfire, we tend to think of it, especially in our county where we have been so heavily impacted for so many years now. We tend to think of wildfire as this enormous, monstrous thing that comes roaring out of the mountains to consume everything in its path. But really, we need to start thinking of wildfire more in terms of what is it that causes combustion of homes. And there's a couple of ways that that happens. And one is direct flame impact. That's if you have fuels that are so close to your home that they actually transmit flame to the structure itself. Radiant heat is when you have nearby sources of heat, which could be vegetation, but could also be neighboring structures or sheds or things like that, that expose that home to heat. But now, you know, in my world, 15 years ago, I had to explain what embers were. I don't have to explain that anymore because most everybody in this county now knows what an ember is. It's a burning piece of wood or something between the size of a pea and the size of a football or even larger that are blowing around like crazy, like a blizzard during these wildland fires. Often a mile or more ahead of the fire, you have these ember storms. 80% of home loss is caused not by radiant heat or direct flame, but by an ember landing on a component on or near the house, which gives it a chance to sustain ignition. And exactly how they do that, or they'll blow into the gutters. And if your gutters are full, you expose the roof at a vulnerable spot, where the deck meets the wall, on deck furniture, through the vents that are used for ventilating the home, under doors and open windows, on combustibles that are within 5 feet of the house. They have a million ways that they can actually cause home ignition. And there are ways that we can both build for and retrofit structures to resist these ember ignitions. Dr. Quarles came up with 6 priorities for structural hardening, which are: number 1, the roof and the roof edge. Or the roof is very vulnerable if it's not a Class A roof built to withstand burning things on it. The edges need to be protected, and you can't have cracks and woodpecker holes and stuff like that. The vents, both attic and foundation vents, need to have a minimum of 8-inch covering, mesh covering, or better yet, be a wildland urban interface or a WUI approved product. Vegetation and defensible space, Dr. Quarles puts in as priority number 3, because these embers can blow in from miles away and hit the house regardless of the surrounding stuff. So if you have a highly vulnerable roof, like a wood roof, or highly vulnerable vents, you really need to get to those in a very high priority with treating your defensible space. Windows should have 1 pane of tempered glass, be dual paned. Decks, great if they're non-combustible, but there are many things that you can do to sort of decrease the probability that a deck's going to burn, primarily amongst them, keeping them extremely clean. Both don't put combustible items under a wooden deck, and also keep them really clean on top. Make sure that the debris isn't piling up between the deck boards and the ledger boards, and just keep them super clean and keep your vegetation back from the edge. Siding, which tends to be the first thing people think of when I talk about structure hardening, is actually number 6 of 6 priorities, because it's a vertical surface, right? It's hard for those embers to penetrate the siding unless the siding is extremely degraded or has cracks or fissures or things like that, which can often be filled with caulk. Can be a priority for replacement in some instances, but these are the things that Dr. Quarles would bring up for what we need to do to harden our homes against ignition. Defensible space is a zone of 100 feet from the structure walls, which is set up into zones. Zone 2 is the zone from 30 feet from the structure out to 100 feet or to the property line, whichever comes first. That area, which is called the Wildland Fuels Reduction Zone, is mostly about moderating the power of an oncoming wildfire so that the fire gets back down on the ground and it can't jump from tree to tree and go up into the tree canopy. So a lot of that is mostly about reducing what we call ladder fuels, which are low growing brush, grasses, things like that, that are going to send the fire both up into the treetops and across the landscape. So reduction of ladder fuels, which will also save the trees that are in that area that you probably want to preserve. Zone 1, I like to call the lean, clean, and green zone. That goes from the house walls out for 30 feet. That area you really want to keep as non-combustible as possible. You can have plants in there, you can have trees in there. They need to be well maintained and separated so that they can't transmit flame vertically or horizontally or vertically. But the one that we're really starting to talk about now, and this is a lot of research has gone into this in the last 10 years, is what we're calling the non-ignition zone or the 0 to 5 foot zone. It has many, many names. But one of the things that has come from recent fires is how common it is for fires to start within 5 feet of the house walls, can start hours or even days after a wildfire has occurred. When an ember is landed on something, it sits in there, it smolders, it smolders, it smolders, and it finally gains enough power to ignite into flames, expose the house. We're really starting to strongly encourage that property owners create this 0 to 5 foot non-combustible zone around their homes and have nothing in that zone that can participate in the process of ignition. So this is becoming important. It's starting to be talked about on a state requirement level. It's not yet a state requirement. But I think it may become, and many local ordinances are now requiring this 0 to 5 foot zone. And don't forget, in that 0 to 5 foot zone, it's the little things that will often get you, those jute doormats that are right under your glass door, your garbage cans. Really think about your stuff. Take a look at your house, take a walk around, look at highly flammable plants, especially those that are in inside corners, under windows or under vents, and really think about what could ignite if an ember landed on it. One of the things that is really important, I think, that we think about is the environmental consequences of home ignition. And we know that there's a ton of consequences, emotional, financial, all of the stuff that goes with losing homes. But one of the things that I think that we don't always think about is the secondary costs after the toxic and the toxic runoff and all that stuff. First, we have to get rid of all those toxins that are on the site left over from the fire. Now we have to take and put them somewhere in some landfill somewhere. And all of this takes diesel. And then we have to rebuild the house. And so that's more diesel, more supplies, more stuff. So the environmental consequences of home loss go beyond just losing the home. And preventing homes from igniting, which is increasingly possible as we learn more through the science of this, really is a possibility, and it should be a very high priority, and that is those near home fuels. On the large landscape level, there are some great plans out there that exist. This is the Sea Ranch's Fuels Management Program, which they've had in place for over 20 years now. Where they took the entire community along the coast, looked at their areas and figured out, okay, where do we need our roadside fuel breaks and how wide do they need to be? Where do we need downslope calming zones so that if a fire comes across the highway and gets into those tall trees, what do we need to do to reduce risk to the houses up above? And so they designed an entire large landscape fuels management plant for the Sea Ranch, which has been underway for many, many years. A couple of the things they use to make this work, and it does work well. They have one of the first established sheep and goat grazing programs, which is very popular with folks and works really well. They also have a contract directly with CAL FIRE, who inspects the ranch on a rotating basis. Most people are getting inspections every year to 3 years. So it's been a really, really successful approach, and it has been really well done. The next thing that I want to touch on briefly is another project that I'm working on, which is the update of the Sonoma County Community Wildfire Protection Plan, or CWPP, as I will doubtlessly be referring to it in the future. A CWPP has the intention of bringing together all of the stakeholders in the wildland-urban interface arena, federal, state, local fire agencies, land management agencies, but especially community groups and individuals to collaboratively identify wildfire risks and issues and prioritize areas for treatment and the most appropriate strategies to reduce those risks in those areas. A CWPP is not a regulatory document. It is driven and informed by input that we get from the stakeholders and from the risk assessment, which we are working on, which is based on using geographic information systems technology to really look at potential fire behavior, flame lengths, spread, difficulty of suppression, to combine all of these things together in order to have a very data-informed decision-making process tool that will help us figure out where and what are the best strategies to reduce risk. At the end of the day, we will also participate with the communities to create those lists of community preparedness projects that might be launched in their area. The Community Wildfire Protection Plan will be annexed into the Sonoma County Multi-Jurisdiction Hazard Mitigation Plan, which addresses, and I think Gary will be talking more about this, so I'm not going to harp on these issues. But the great thing about integrating the CWPP is that it will be updated along with the hazard mitigation plan and will receive formal adoption by the state and by FEMA, who has funded the update for the CWPP. We have multiple opportunities for folks to participate. We will be doing public input meetings probably in April and May. We're going by supervisory districts, so I hope you can join in the appropriate meeting. You will be able to have direct input via our story map, which will be up online pretty soon. Our website, we will be, once the draft is done, we'll be doing meetings similar to this one to introduce the draft to folks and take comments and have more meetings for public review. You can see what we're up to on our website at sonomacounty.ca.gov/fire prevention wildfire plan, or you can email us at permit-sonoma-wildfireplan@sonomacounty.org. Thank you, and I will look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Carleone. The last bit of this is talking about how this informs LCP policy, because the coast is unique in that protection of coastal resources is the highest priority in our policies. And so there sometimes can be a direct conflict between managing fire fuel, which involves removing or modifying vegetation, and protection of coastal resources. So one of the policy options that we will be developing is a program to balance defensible space with the protection of natural resource. And also, you know, Carleone did emphasize everything that can be done to protect structures, but that shouldn't really make people not think that there still is significant risk from wildfires that have their origin in timberlands, especially non-commercial timberlands that then spread into residential areas. So fuel management everywhere is very important. And so we'll develop some policy options for non-commercial timberland fuel management. Right now, that's a fairly difficult thing for property owners to do without getting a coastal permit every time they want to do any fuel reduction. And hopefully we are going to consider applying to the Coastal Commission for an exclusion order for fire fuel management. Exclusion orders require a 2/3 vote of the Coastal Commission, and the last exclusion order we did in this county was in 1981. So it's getting kind of old. But we also need to make sure that we update the LCP so that it harmonizes with the exclusion order. So we'd probably take both things at the same time to the Coastal Commission. And one of the big opportunities that we have for non-commercial timberland management, for fuel management in general on large properties, is using the existing exclusion that we have. It's called Category E. That's for fuel management within state parks and regional parks, and some of the reserve areas, although it's interesting if places like Jenner Headlands are not part of the exclusion order because the exclusion order is so old. The way this program works is that the vegetation management plan is reviewed and adopted once, and then each year when you want to do your work, you would come in and give us 10 days notice you're going to do it, and we make sure it's consistent with your vegetation management plan. But this is a tool that I think really could go a long way so far as mitigating wildfire hazard and making the coastal area far more resilient. You know, as we said in the beginning, we never expected to see fires of the magnitude and severity of the Myers-Grade fire. There have been historic fires in the past, but the level of damage that was done by that fire and the intensity of that fire was really extraordinary. And in light of climate change, it's likely that we're going to see more of these in the future. So the LCP has to have the tools in it and the policies in it to let people maintain their property, let people be safe, and, you know, create a resilient coast. So, you know, with that, that's the end of our presentation here, and we would love to hear from everybody. Open it up to discussion, and Cecily will be moderating.
Thank you. I do believe, Gary, we have gallery view enabled for most of our PC users. If you can remove the slide so people can get a better feel for who's in the room. I hope this works. You may also need to change some of your individual settings using the 9 square option. I apologize in advance if that doesn't work or change anyone's view. So we do have both the Q&A open in typed questions as well as the chat function. And for those of you that are interested in speaking, I will be monitoring the raise hand function. So you can raise your hand either by dialing *9 if you phoned in, or finding the raise hand feature on the app. And we did have one question. There we go. We did just add those email addresses, the links to the chat as well that Carleone had provided in her slides. So the first question I see at this time is from the Q&A. Will vegetation management projects included in the CWPP and or in accordance with county fire safe standards be able to be implemented without a coastal development permit? I do believe that Gary partially answered this question in his slides, that this is the goal of improving our exclusion order. But at this time, without that exclusion order, they would be required to do a coastal development permit. The next question I see is, has there been any public funding made available yet for private property? Carleone, do you know of funding available for any of these programs?
For fuels management programs, I'm sorry, I'm multitasking. I realized that first email I put in there had a typo in it, so I am re-entering that.
Thank you. I can speak to that, Cecily. That's okay.
Thank you, Robert.
As far as the availability of funding, I'm not sure, but I do know that the programs that are available include the California Forest Improvement Program, the North Bay Forest Improvement Program, and then NRCS's EQIP program. Those are some of the more popular programs, I guess, that give private landowners funds or reimbursement programs for fuel management type projects.
And there is an increasing interest in funneling money down to communities for fuels management projects from the state, from a variety of state legislations that have gone through, and miscellaneous projects. There does seem to be more funding coming down the pike. Most grant funding is going to be for larger scale projects that involve a community, and you probably will need to have some kind of a governmental entity or nonprofit to do the application for you. There's not a whole lot of funding out there for individual property owners.
Thank you. We've also received a question for, will this policy begin to include an effort to speak with tribal peoples and incorporate indigenous land management techniques, including controlled burns? I know that our LCP update process does include tribal coordination. Carleone, can you confirm if the CWPP or hazard mitigation plan would include any of those efforts?
The hazard mitigation plan is including tribal members, and we're in the process of bringing them into our steering committee as well for the CWPP. So absolutely, prescribed burning is a great tool that we have access to help us reduce fuels in those larger landscape areas.
Thank you. Chris Howard has asked, I assume the Sea Ranch CWP has updated approximately a year ago. Is there much else you needed to assist for the Sonoma County CWPP efforts? This is from the Sea Ranch Association.
Local CWPPs will be annexed into the county plan as appendices. So we'll definitely want to see your update and make sure that we have the current version, which will be put into the plan, and would strongly encourage you guys' participation in the CWPP process, because you have done such great work up there for so long. So your contributions would be valuable, and we strongly encourage you to reach out to me via the email so we can make sure that your needs are being considered.
And this is probably a question for Gary. What progress is being made for Highway 1 improvements after the Myers grade destruction?
Caltrans has obtained emergency permits for replacement of all the retaining walls. And right now what they're evaluating is a temporary replacement versus a more permanent replacement that wouldn't use flammable materials. I mean, interestingly, the wood cribbing was specifically used for aesthetic reasons, because the assumption was there'd never be a fire hot enough to get those massive pieces of wood burning. So yes, we've got 2 of the 5 projects are underway and under construction, and they anticipate rebuilding that entire section of the roadway by the end of next year.
Thank you. And we had a follow-up question to the funding inquiry. Several of the larger developments in the coast are HOAs. Would they qualify more likely for mitigation funding?
HOAs usually can put in applications as the HOA for funding, so that is certainly a possibility. The better the project design, the more likely you are to get funded. So start working early on your project design and really thinking about projects that will have a positive effect on the entire area, from the wildland fuels on down to the homes. But CAL FIRE's priorities are in this order. Number 1 is life safety. Number 2 is property protection. and number 3 is the environment. So that's a good thing to bear in mind as you're doing projects. And another thing on the funding front, I realized I'm sitting here saying, oh, we don't have much money to help individual homeowners. Permits, Sonoma and John Mack is heavily involved in all of these programs. Have several projects in place and under consideration, which are looking at doing focused property assessments with property owners so that they can look at both the defensible space and the structure hardening, and then allowing a process for the property owners to access incentive funding to help mitigate some of the problems that are identified by the assessors on the program. Thus far, we have a first project going. There are 10 areas within the county that have been pre-selected, and where it's really a pilot, and we're figuring out how it's going to work. We have more funds in the application process to start expanding those out, including a very large grant that will focus on 3 communities from a very near home basis, moving into a larger sort of scattered homes on the landscape, and then looking at the large fuel forested landscapes abutting those communities and applying treatments to each of those areas so that we're hitting all of the necessary components to reduce risk in those communities. So there's a lot of exciting work going on with the projects that we have underway currently at Permit Sonoma. And I think we'll be seeing a lot more of this kind of stuff in the future.
Thank you. John, do you have anything to add regarding those programs?
I think the only thing is that I don't know that any of them are singling out the coastal zone in particular, or they have their own project areas or geographies, or they're going to be county-wide in a sense efforts, which would be inclusive of the coastal zone, but not singling it out necessarily as a separate area to work within. So.
Thank you. And C had also asked that Gary mentioned finding the balance between preserving the coastal resources and wildfire management. So under the development of this exclusion order, how will riparian areas as well as other ESHA be protected? And really that is the work that we know we need to do. We're expecting that to be the first question from the Coastal Commission as well. And not to put anyone on the spot, but as we're just now starting to develop this program, I don't know if Robert would have anything to say about how we could start evaluating that early on.
Yeah, I would assume the development of any exclusion order would incorporate either conditions or requirements to comply with other elements of the coastal plan or program. So that would include protection of ESHAs and the riparian areas. So that's, I mean, again, it's still kind of talking in theory about this exclusion order, but that would be my understanding of how it would be developed. It wouldn't just be a standalone, you can go cut without repercussions, but that it would be a balanced, holistic treatment option.
And just as an example, so for under the county's current riparian corridor program, there is an allowed amount of fire vegetation management use. We have a fairly detailed guidance document Robert and I actually worked on that sort of lays out how to balance between how far and how close you need to be to structures, how much vegetation you can remove while preserving riparian corridor functions and values. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely, so there's actually existing protections for a lot of things right now, even today in the corridor or in the coastal zone, excuse me, that are already there. But yeah, the ESHA piece, I think, we'll be talking about that more on Friday. That has a tendency to trump other things or provide additional restrictions or requirements. So.
Thank you. Another question's been added. Are there new escape routes defined for emergencies or existing ones maintained with no new additions? So
Yeah, sorry, go ahead,
sorry,
Cecily.
no, go ahead, Gary, please.
I was gonna say evacuation in the coast is fairly challenging because there's one road. It's Highway 1, and there's 7 or 8 roads that get you east west, and that's it. So the good and the bad is that developing evacuation routes is not that complicated, but it is that challenging to make them effective and make them work. It's sort of beyond the scope of the LCP. I mean, that's getting into a fire and emergency services function is actually developing those escape routes.
Yeah, escape route planning falls to Department of Emergency Management and the
Right.
sheriff. So it's outside of my immediate kin as Sonoma County Fire Prevention.
Well, and it does have an additional challenge, whereas we do have tsunami evacuation routes posted all over the coast. The behavior of a tsunami is very known. I mean, when the coast gets inundated, it's known how the water, it's known it'll come from the Pacific Ocean and how it'll flow inland. Wildfires are not that predictable. So it would be very difficult to have something as simple as a signage program that would say that this is the evacuation route in the case of a wildfire. It needs to be a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. I did want to add that I'm more than happy to monitor the chat, but that this was not supposed to fully replace people wanting to speak up or ask their questions directly. So I just want to encourage anybody. We are still also using that raise hand and or using the *9 function if you have comments that you'd like to add without using the chat function. I'm totally happy to use the Q&A function, but I just don't want people to feel limited or that they can't speak up and ask their questions live either. There's also a question on the merging of fire services for Sonoma County. This has not been something that the LCP has been largely involved in. Carleone, are you aware of an appropriate answer to how does the merging of fire services into the Sonoma County Fire impact coastal communities? Does it apply to all coastal districts and departments?
I'm not really qualified to speak to that.
And that would also be our emergency services department, correct? Or
and LAFCO and a variety of agencies that are working on those consolidations. It's a pretty complicated process.
thank you. Are there any specifications on the topic of cultural burning, controlled burns, in collaboration with local tribes and CAL FIRE like they do at Jenner Headlands? I'm not familiar with that specific project at Jenner Headlands, but it is something that we would look into.
Any prescribed fire, I don't think there are going to be specifics other than the general rules that are going to apply to who you have on site with you, what are you burning, what's the stuff you're burning. So it takes a plan and it takes a permit, and yeah.
Thank you. Brendan O'Neill has asked, aside from riparian areas, what forest types within the Sonoma County coastal zone are considered ESHA?
That's a good question. The other ones that would come to mind as at least candidates for it would be the forest types that are considered sensitive natural communities. under CDFW's list of sensitive natural communities. So, which is actually, there's quite a few forest types that are in that regard. So I think those could arguably be ESHA. But truing up the ESHA definition with these other definitions, there's not a one-to-one match often. So.
Cecily, I think you're muted.
We have someone on the phone that has come up to speak. So if you could unmute yourself, you've been allowed to talk. We had a caller with their hand raised.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, this is Matt Green, and wondering if in the meantime, while you are developing these exemptions or whatever you're going to, allow work to be done within Defensible Space, if project proponents can come to you with specific wants rather than having to go through the coastal zone or the coastal development process. It's currently handicapping all of our land management in terms of fuel defense right now.
So we do still need to go through the Coastal Commission process. However, often Permit Sonoma is engaged in that. So if you could send me a follow-up email separately, I'd be happy to see if there's anything that we can help facilitate. But at this time, coastal permit is still required to my knowledge. Thank you. And we have a new question in the chat. Why is the area identified for threat of storm impact only the Bodega Bay area? The entire coast would be affected by major storms. We already have coastal erosion in other areas.
That's the only area? Sorry, that I'd have to look at the map. It'd be unusual if that's the case. And the hazard maps don't really show storms as a hazard, as a specific hazard. So perhaps some clarification on what's meant by that.
Thank you. We will work to clarify that.
Yeah.
I do believe that that may be related to the focused vulnerability assessment that was done, and that focused vulnerability assessment was done only for Bodega Bay. So that may be why that only that area was mapped. But otherwise, we will continue to look into that and make sure that our mapping is representative of the whole coast. The follow-up is, it is the only area identified for climate change impacts to be studied.
We'll probably correct that.
So that will be followed up with the previous map following that we'd identified. And Jason Wallace, you've been allowed to speak. If you could unmute yourself.
Good evening, everybody. I just figure you probably want to hear somebody's voice again. So thanks a lot for putting this on. I appreciate you guys doing this. My question for you is, in terms of sort of your strategy for fuels management and approaching the Coastal Commission, are you thinking that you would be going more along the route of extending county fire safe standards, which the county has recently come out with their new direction, which made it much more clear, I think, in terms of what is expected for the fire safe standards and how the registered professional forester community could fit into that sort of thing? Or are you thinking that it would have to be specifically something, projects that are outlined in a larger document, like a community wildfire protection plan? Or I guess I'm just asking, the question is more about flexibility than, or an approach that you guys are thinking than anything. Did that make sense?
It did. And I think actually our program is more conceptual than that at this point. So all ideas are on the table right now, and certainly we appreciate any input, any help you want to give us. We would love the assistance.
Yeah, I wrote a letter or earlier in the process, and I'll just say, there's a community of licensed professionals that are out there, and we're writing plans, like management plans for either individual properties or larger components, CWPPs, whatever, that there's an opportunity there. Almost all of our plans get reviewed by CAL FIRE in some way, but we could use that planning document that's going to go over the sorts of things that Robert was talking about in terms of what are the values that we're trying to save or promote. If we're worried about riparian areas or other sensitive areas, you can write these management plans, and it'd be nice if we could submit them directly to the county rather than going through the statewide Coastal Commission. So I really appreciate that you guys are talking about this and thinking about the overall landscape level fuels treatments. And I'll be here again on Friday when you guys are talking about the environmental component, but there's a lot of work also that can be done to improve the environmental side of things. I mean, some of the things I'm thinking about are, and also it's a fuel hazard, but sudden oak death stuff that's going on and around Fort Ross, and different sorts of treatments that we could be doing to sort of improve the health and vigor of the stands that are in those areas. There's this woolly adelgid is a newly introduced pest species. It's killing some of our trees in there. There's Douglas fir problems. So, we've got other problems that don't show immediately as a fuels problem today, but also are kind of in conflict with the stated goals and objectives of the coastal zone in terms of its beauty and scenic values and other sorts of things. So I'm sure you'll hear from me again on Friday, but I just wanted to say thanks for putting this on and let you answer a question that wasn't in text form.
Thank you.
We appreciate input in every form.
Thank you. And we have another question. Will Myers grade fire impact areas be ruled out for development in the future? This has not been something that has been applied in other parts of the county, and I do not believe that they would get any kind of restriction on development in the future for having been within that perimeter. That said, it was a relatively rural area. Additionally, another question that I believe is more related to our emergency services. Is anything being done to extend communication along the coast for emergency services? How will emergency services have safe access in and out on the narrow rural roads?
I'm hearing silence, so I'm guessing that
Well, communication's easy. Roads are hard. That's the big comment there, that most of the telecommunication facilities that are going in now are heavily integrated with emergency services. So it's really a good outcome from the cell towers that we're putting out there. All have microwave links. They'll sometimes bring in the fiber optic that we desperately need. So that's easy, the connectivity, because the companies that build that stuff want to develop it, and it's done at no cost to the public. It's private enterprise. But the roads, widening roads is really close to impossible. And it's for two reasons. One is it involves a take of private property in most cases, and it's going to increase the impact of the road, which means that we're going to damage resources. And the amount of studies that we have to do to widen a lot of the coastal roads just make them extraordinarily expensive and very challenging to develop. So it's hard. It's just very hard to do to improve the roads in the coastal zone.
And a follow-up to that was, wouldn't wider roads just draw more traffic?
If they didn't go up and downhill. I mean, that is actually the other part, is we still have the terrain. Even if the road is wide, if it's a 30% grade, you've still got an issue, and we're not going to, it'd be unreasonable to think that we're going to just go out and bulldoze the landscape to build roads that are easy to drive fast on.
An additional follow-up, limiting uses that require emergency services along rural narrow roads would be another possibility. So this is something that is done through the conditioning process of projects throughout the county, is to consider, it's relatively new as part of the CEQA checklist as well, but to consider the threat of putting population density within high risk hazard areas as being something that we do need to consciously evaluate, and potentially either condition the project to put that burden on developing an improvement, or otherwise lowering the the potential for the actual maximum density or development that may be occurring. And Gary, people like your cat.
Is he wandering around now?
I was wondering if anyone was going to mention it, actually.
It's past his dinner time. He gets fed at 6:30. The other point too for development in narrow roads is, we analyze this a lot with the housing element. There just isn't much development potential left in the coast. All the easy parcels have been developed, and the parcels in the remote areas tend to be very large, and the land use doesn't allow them to be subdivided. So it's only really going to be a handful of homes that could be built in the future in these very remote areas within the coast. This is the other thing to bear in mind, is the coastal zone is very small and very narrow. So often a road that somebody is thinking of that is sketchy is out of the coastal zone. Although Myers Grade and Fort Ross Road are plenty sketchy.
All right, well, we are at about time. I'm doing one final look for any additional questions or inputs to the chat. Well, thank you everyone for this discussion. I've found it to be extremely helpful. And I look forward to continuing to work with you all and hoping to see everyone on Friday as well. So one last moment. All right. I see no new hands or questions. So with that, we will end the evening tonight. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Oh, and so everyone knows tonight we had at its highest capacity, I believe 34 participants. Currently it's at 24, but I believe we've lost a few in just the last few minutes. Thank you. Good night.
Okay, good night, everyone.